I sat in our family living room watching my parents deliver their ultimatum, with the same calm expression I had perfected over 24 years of disappointment. Dad cleared his throat dramatically, adjusting his reading glasses, as if he was announcing something monumental. Mom fidgeted with her wedding ring, avoiding eye contact, but nodding along like a loyal sidekick. Behind them, Mason lounged against the doorframe with that insufferable smirk plastered across his face, arms crossed in victory. "Your college tuition stops immediately," Dad declared, his voice heavy with manufactured authority. The weight of those words should have crushed me, but instead I felt an odd sense of clarity wash over my mind. 3 weeks away from graduating summa cum laude, and they were pulling my funding because I had dared to speak the truth about their precious golden boy. "Until you publicly apologize to your brother for attacking his character and spreading lies, you will withdraw from your final semester," Mom added softly, finally meeting my eyes with what she probably thought was motherly concern. "Mason has been deeply traumatized by your behavior at Thanksgiving dinner. He needs to hear you acknowledge the damage you have caused to heal properly." I glanced at Mason, whose smirk widened as he watched what he assumed would be my breakdown. 22 years old college dropout living in our childhood bedroom, and somehow still the family prince who could do absolutely no wrong in their eyes. The real story started 2 weeks ago during our extended family Thanksgiving gathering. Aunt Helen, Uncle Bill, and their teenage daughter Emma had driven down from Portland for the long weekend. Cousins David and Sarah came in from Sacramento with their new baby. It was supposed to be our traditional feast, where everyone caught up on the year's adventures and shared gratitude for family bonds. Mason had spent the entire appetizer hour bragging about his latest entrepreneurial venture. He painted himself as some sort of business genius who had discovered a revolutionary investment opportunity that would change everyone's financial future forever. His enthusiasm was infectious as he described the incredible returns people were seeing, the simple process of getting involved, and the life-changing potential for anyone smart enough to recognize the opportunity. I had been half listening while helping Mom arrange the dinner rolls when something about his pitch triggered my internal alarm system. The language he used, the promises he made, the way he deflected specific questions about the actual business model. It all sounded eerily familiar from a consumer protection seminar I had attended as part of my business ethics coursework. After dinner, while everyone else watched football in the living room, I cornered Mason in the kitchen as he grabbed another beer from the refrigerator. The house buzzed with comfortable family chatter, making our conversation feel safely private. "That investment thing you were talking about?" I said quietly, loading dishes into the dishwasher. "Can you explain exactly how it works?" Mason's confident demeanor shifted slightly, but he maintained his casual tone. "It's pretty complex, Polly. Probably over your head since you are still stuck in theoretical classroom stuff instead of real-world business." "Try me," I pressed, turning to face him directly. "I have been studying business operations for 3.5 years. I think I can handle whatever complexity you are dealing with." He launched into an explanation that made my stomach drop. New members paid an initial fee to join the program. They earned money primarily by recruiting other new members who also paid fees. The actual product being sold was some vague digital marketing course that nobody seemed to actually use or benefit from. Success stories focused entirely on recruitment earnings rather than product sales or legitimate business growth. "Mason," I said carefully, "that sounds exactly like a pyramid scheme." His laugh was sharp and dismissive. "You are just jealous because I am making real money while you are still begging Mom and Dad for spending cash." "Those are illegal in most states," I continued, ignoring his jab. "And they specifically target people who cannot afford to lose money. You mentioned recruiting neighbors. Are you talking about the elderly people in our subdivision?" "Mrs. Patterson from down the street joined last week," he said proudly. "So did Mr. Johnson and his wife. They are thrilled about the income potential." My heart sank as I pictured our retired neighbors living on fixed incomes, handing over their limited savings to my brother's fraudulent scheme. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned struggling with medical bills when Mom brought her soup during her recent illness. The Johnsons were saving every penny to visit their grandchildren in Florida. Mason, you need to stop this immediately, I said firmly. Those people trust you because you are part of their community. They cannot afford to lose whatever money you are taking from them. His expression hardened completely. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. This is a legitimate business opportunity, and I am helping people improve their financial situations. Just because you are stuck in some ivory tower academic bubble doesn't mean you understand how real entrepreneurship works. I understand enough to recognize fraud when I see it, I shot back. That's when his mask slipped entirely. You know what, Polly? Even if you are right, which you are not, Mom and Dad would never believe your word over mine. They have always known who the real success story in this family is, and it sure as hell is not their little bookworm daughter who has never made a real dollar in her life. The casual cruelty in his voice confirmed everything I had suspected about our family dynamic for years. But hearing it stated so bluntly still stung more than I expected. 15 minutes later, we rejoined the family gathering. Aunt Helen was asking Mason more detailed questions about his business, clearly considering whether to invest her retirement savings. I looked around at my relatives, good people who worked hard their entire lives and deserved better than to be scammed by someone they trusted. Mason, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, could you tell everyone exactly how people make money in your program? The room went quiet as Mason's face flushed red. Polly, this is not the time or place for business discussions. Actually, since you spent dinner encouraging family members to invest, this seems like exactly the right time to clarify the details, I replied calmly. What happened next was something I had never witnessed before. Mason, the smooth talker who could charm his way out of any situation, completely lost control. He started shouting about how I was jealous of his success and trying to sabotage him out of spite. He accused me of being a miserable person who could not stand seeing others succeed. His voice got louder and more aggressive with each accusation. She has always been jealous of me, he yelled, pointing his finger in my face. She cannot handle that I am making real money while she is still playing student. She wants to tear down anyone who threatens her image as the family genius. Uncle Bill stood up clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. Maybe we should all just calm down and change the subject. But Mason was not finished. No, everyone needs to know what kind of person my sister really is. She is vindictive and jealous, and she will say anything to hurt me because she knows I am more successful than she will ever be. With that, he stormed out of the room, grabbing his jacket and slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom immediately went into damage control mode, explaining that Mason had been under tremendous stress lately and apologizing for the outburst. Dad mumbled something about sibling rivalry getting out of hand. Our relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances and began making polite excuses about needing to help with the baby or check on their car. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home or retired to their guest rooms, my parents cornered me in the kitchen. They were furious that I had humiliated Mason in front of the extended family and attacked his business venture without understanding the details. They accused me of deliberately provoking him and ruining what should have been a peaceful family holiday. No amount of explanation about pyramid schemes or elderly victims could penetrate their protective shield around Mason. They had made up their minds that I was the problem, and nothing I said would change their perspective. Now, sitting in our living room 2 weeks later, I understood that this ultimatum was Mason's revenge for that Thanksgiving confrontation. He had spent the intervening time convincing our parents that I was a jealous, vindictive sister who had launched an unprovoked attack on his character and business success. I have made my decision, I said, simply meeting each of their eyes in turn. All right. The word hung in the air like a small explosion. They had expected tears, arguments, desperate pleas for forgiveness. They had prepared for a battle and received immediate surrender instead. Dad's smile spread slowly across his face. Well, good. I am glad you understand that family loyalty comes first. Mom nodded approvingly. Once you apologize properly, we can put this whole unfortunate situation behind us and move forward as a family. Mason pushed off from the doorframe, practically glowing with satisfaction. I knew you would eventually do the right thing, Polly. It just took you a while to realize you cannot win against the truth. I stood up from the couch, smoothing down my jeans. I will take care of everything tomorrow. Walking to my car in our driveway, I felt the familiar weight of 24 years' worth of family dysfunction settling around my shoulders like a heavy coat. This was not the first time Mason had emerged victorious from a conflict that should have exposed his problematic behavior. It was simply the latest episode in a long-running pattern that I had been too close to see clearly until now. My phone buzzed with a text from my roommate asking about dinner plans. As I typed back that I would be late, my mind began cataloging the history that had led to this moment. Each memory felt like evidence in a case I had been unconsciously building for years. Mason's troubles started early, though our parents had always found creative ways to reframe them as misunderstandings or temporary setbacks. In 8th grade, he was caught cheating on his final history exam. Rather than accepting that their son had made a serious academic integrity violation, my parents convinced themselves that the teacher had set impossible standards and was unfairly targeting Mason because of personal bias. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when Dad came home from his meeting with the principal and teacher. Instead of discussing consequences for Mason's behavior, Dad spent the entire dinner ranting about incompetent educators who did not understand different learning styles. Mason nodded along sympathetically, playing the role of misunderstood student, while avoiding any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. High school brought bigger problems with increasingly elaborate explanations. The drinking incident during his junior year was dismissed as peer pressure from bad influences. When Mason crashed Dad's Camry into a mailbox at 2 a.m, they decided he had been going through a particularly difficult emotional period and needed support rather than punishment. The insurance handled the financial damage, and the family simply absorbed the inconvenience. I was a sophomore at the time, maintaining a 4.0 grade average while working weekends at the local library to save money for college applications. I watched my parents bend over backwards to protect Mason from consequences while holding me to increasingly high standards of academic and behavioral excellence. The contrast became even more stark during our respective college experiences. I had spent my senior year of high school applying for scholarships, writing essays, and preparing for standardized tests. My acceptance to State University came with partial academic scholarships that I had earned through years of consistent performance. I was proud of the financial aid package I had assembled through merit and need-based awards. Mason, on the other hand, barely managed to graduate high school after several last-minute interventions from our parents with administrators and teachers. His college applications were submitted late with minimal effort, and he was eventually accepted to a regional school with significantly lower admission standards. Our parents paid his full tuition and expenses without question, treating his acceptance as an achievement worth celebrating. 3 months into his first semester, Mason called home complaining about unfair professors, impossible workloads, and social isolation from his classmates. Rather than encouraging him to utilize tutoring services, study groups, or counseling resources, our parents immediately began discussing whether the school was a good fit for his learning style and personality. By Christmas break, the narrative had solidified. Mason was too intelligent for his classes, too mature for his immature classmates, and too sophisticated for the rural campus culture. The professors were biased against students like him, and the coursework was designed for people without real-world experience or practical intelligence. He withdrew at the end of the fall semester and moved back into his childhood bedroom. Our parents framed this as a temporary reset that would allow him to find a better educational fit for his unique talents and learning needs. That was 4 years ago. In the time since, Mason had enrolled in and dropped out of community college twice, attempted several online certification programs without completion, and cycled through approximately 15 different jobs in various retail and service industries. Each employment termination came with a detailed explanation of workplace incompetence, unfair management practices, or hostile work environments that made success impossible for someone with Mason's integrity and work ethic. Never once had our parents suggested that the common denominator in all these failures might be Mason himself. Meanwhile, I had maintained Dean's List status throughout my college career while working part-time jobs to supplement my scholarship funding. I tutored other students, participated in research projects with professors, and completed internships that provided real-world experience in my field of study. None of these achievements generated the same level of family attention or celebration that Mason received for basic life activities, like filling out job applications or attending interviews. The financial disparity was something I had tried not to think about too deeply, but tonight it felt impossible to ignore. My partial scholarships covered tuition and some expenses, but I had always assumed that my college fund was smaller than Mason's because my academic performance had reduced the family's financial burden. It seemed logical that merit-based aid would free up resources for other family needs. But as I sat in my car in the driveway, a disturbing possibility began to take shape. What if my college fund had not been smaller from the beginning? What if the account had been depleted over time to cover Mason's various disasters and failed ventures? The pyramid scheme investment he was running suddenly felt like the inevitable culmination of years of enabled irresponsibility. Our parents had spent so much time protecting Mason from consequences that he had never learned to distinguish between legitimate opportunities and fraudulent schemes. Worse, he had never developed the moral compass that would prevent him from exploiting vulnerable people for personal gain. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, who had trusted our family for 20 years and brought us casseroles when Dad had his appendectomy. I pictured Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, who always waved from their front porch and asked about my studies whenever they saw me walking to my car. These people had invested their limited resources in Mason's scheme because they trusted him as a member of their community and an extension of our family's reputation. That trust would be shattered when the scheme inevitably collapsed, and they lost their money. But Mason would once again emerge with some explanation about market forces or business complications beyond his control. Our parents would sympathize with his disappointment and help him move on to the next opportunity, without addressing the real damage he had caused to innocent people. Unless someone finally held him accountable for his choices and their consequences. Unless someone refused to play along with the family's elaborate system of protection and denial. Sitting alone in my car, I realized that I had been unconsciously documenting this dysfunction for years. Every family dinner conversation, every financial discussion, every excuse-making session had left traces in my memory that painted a clear picture of systematic enablement and favoritism. But memory was not enough. If I was going to break this cycle, I would need evidence that could not be dismissed or reframed. I would need proof that was undeniable, even to people who had spent decades perfecting the art of denial. The thought that formed in my mind as I started my car and drove back to campus was both terrifying and exhilarating. What if I stopped playing the role of compliant daughter and started documenting the truth about my family's dysfunction? What if I gathered evidence of Mason's schemes, our parents' enablement, and the financial manipulation that had shaped our family's dynamics for years? What if for once in my life I fought back? The next morning arrived with the same crisp December air that had marked the beginning of every winter break throughout my college career, but this year felt fundamentally different. I drove to campus with a sense of purpose that surprised me with its intensity. My parents expected me to spend the day wallowing in self-pity and preparing to grovel for Mason's forgiveness. Instead, I was about to put a plan into motion that I had been unconsciously developing for months. My first stop was the registrar's office, where I found Jennifer Martinez behind the counter, sorting through transcript requests. We had worked together on several student government initiatives, and she was one of the few staff members who truly understood the bureaucratic maze that students had to navigate. "Polly, what brings you in during break week?" she asked with genuine warmth. "I thought you would be home celebrating your upcoming graduation." "Actually, I need to discuss some transcript and transfer credit issues," I said carefully. "It might be complicated." Jennifer's expression shifted to professional concern as she gestured toward the private consultation area. "Let's sit down and see what's going on." For the next hour, I explained my situation in carefully chosen terms that focused on family financial difficulties rather than personal conflicts. Jennifer listened without judgment as I described the need to potentially transfer schools for my final semester due to unexpected changes in my funding situation. You realize that graduating from a different institution could complicate your summa cum laude status, she said gently. You have worked incredibly hard to achieve that level of academic distinction. I understand the risks, I replied, but I need to explore all my options right now. That's when Jennifer surprised me with information I had not expected. 3 weeks earlier, Dr. Sarah Chen from the Psychology Research Institute at Northern State University had called asking about exceptional students who might be interested in graduate research opportunities. She specifically mentioned wanting to recruit someone with my academic profile and research experience. I was planning to mention it when you came back from break, Jennifer explained. But given your current situation, it might be worth exploring. Dr. Chen indicated they have emergency funding available for students who need immediate placement. My heart began racing as Jennifer pulled up the contact information. Northern State was actually ranked higher than my current university with a research psychology program that aligned perfectly with my academic interests and career goals. If they had funding available, this could solve multiple problems simultaneously. Could you help me get my transcripts sent over today? I asked. Jennifer nodded, already reaching for the necessary forms. I will mark them as urgent. Dr. Chen should have everything by tomorrow morning. My next stop was the campus library where I had been working as a research assistant for the past 2 years. Professor William Brooks had been my mentor throughout college, guiding my independent study projects and helping me develop analytical skills that extended far beyond psychology coursework. I found him in his office surrounded by stacks of journals and student papers that needed grading before the new semester. He looked up with the warm smile that had made him a favorite among students who appreciated intellectual rigor, combined with genuine personal interest. "Polly, perfect timing," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "I was hoping to discuss your thesis defense timeline when you returned from break." "Actually, Professor Brooks, I need to talk with you about something unexpected." I began settling into the familiar comfort of his office space. Over the next 30 minutes, I explained my family situation with the same careful framing I had used with Jennifer. Professor Brooks listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my academic goals and financial constraints. "This is clearly a difficult situation," he said finally. "But before you make any major decisions, I want you to know about some opportunities that have come across my desk recently." He pulled out a folder that contained correspondence from several graduate programs, including Northern State University. Dr. Chen had specifically inquired about students with my research background and academic performance, particularly those interested in studying family systems and conflict resolution. "Based on your independent study work on family dynamics, you would be an ideal candidate for their program," Professor Brooks explained. "The research assistantship they are offering would cover full tuition plus a living stipend. More importantly, Dr. Chen's lab focuses on exactly the kind of psychological patterns you have been studying." The irony was almost too perfect. My family's dysfunction had inadvertently prepared me for specialized research in family systems therapy. The years of observing manipulation, enablement, and scapegoating had given me insights that could be valuable in helping other families break similar destructive cycles. "If you are serious about this, I can call Dr. Chen today," Professor Brooks offered. "But I want you to understand that transferring with 3 weeks left in your senior year is almost unprecedented. It would require extraordinary circumstances and exceptional academic justification." "I think my circumstances qualify as extraordinary," I said quietly. Professor Brooks studied my face for a moment before reaching for his phone. "Let me make some calls." While he contacted Northern State, I spent the afternoon in the library researching everything I could find about pyramid schemes, elder financial abuse, and family-enabling behaviors. Each article I read confirmed my growing understanding of the dynamics that had shaped my family relationships for years. I also began systematically organizing my evidence. The recordings I'd been making were stored on my phone and laptop, including the conversation with Mason about his investment scheme, and several family dinner discussions where our parents explicitly chose to protect him from consequences. My bank statements told their own story of financial manipulation. The part-time job earnings that I had assumed were being added to my college fund had actually been deposited into an account that showed regular withdrawals coinciding with Mason's various crises and failed ventures. Most damning was an email thread I discovered between my parents discussing how to redistribute resources between their children based on changing needs and opportunities. The language was careful and euphemistic, but the meaning was clear. They had systematically moved money from my education fund to cover Mason's expenses while maintaining the fiction that my scholarships made their financial support unnecessary. By late afternoon, Professor Brooks had arranged a phone interview with Dr. Chen for the following morning. Northern State was prepared to offer emergency admission for the spring semester, starting in January, with full research assistantship funding and credit transfer for all my completed coursework. "This is highly unusual," Professor Brooks warned me, "but Dr. Chen was impressed by your research portfolio and believes you would be an excellent fit for their program. The question is whether you are prepared to make such a dramatic change with essentially no transition time." I thought about going home to face my parents' expectation of apology and submission. I pictured Mason's smug satisfaction as I groveled for forgiveness while he continued exploiting vulnerable elderly neighbors. I imagined spending the next 3 weeks pretending that our family dynamics were healthy and normal while watching the people who were supposed to love and support me prioritize dysfunction over justice. "I am ready for change," I told Professor Brooks. That evening, I called the attorney who had been recommended by my friend's mother. Sarah Thompson specialized in family financial issues and elder abuse cases. She agreed to meet with me the next day to review my evidence and discuss legal options. "Based on what you have described, there are definitely grounds for financial recovery and potentially criminal charges related to the elder fraud," she explained over the phone. "But I want to review your documentation before we discuss specific strategies." As I fell asleep that night, I felt more hopeful than I had in months. For the first time in my life, I was taking control of my own narrative instead of accepting the role that had been assigned to me by family dysfunction. Tomorrow I would begin the process of transforming from victim to advocate. Not just for myself but for all the people who had been harmed by Mason's schemes and our parents' enablement. The game was about to change completely. The next morning dawned with the kind of clarity that only comes after making a decision that aligns your actions with your values for the first time in years. I dressed carefully in professional clothes and drove to campus with a sense of anticipation that felt almost foreign after months of dreading family interactions. My phone interview with Dr. Chen exceeded every expectation I had developed during my research the previous day. She was immediately interested in my academic background. But what really captured her attention was my personal experience with family systems dysfunction. "Your research proposals demonstrate both intellectual rigor and genuine understanding of these psychological dynamics," she explained during our 45-minute conversation. "Students who have lived through complex family situations often bring insights that cannot be learned from textbooks alone." The financial offer was even better than Professor Brooks had indicated. Full tuition coverage, monthly living stipend, and research opportunities that would essentially guarantee acceptance into top-tier doctoral programs after completion of the master's degree. "I can have official admission paperwork ready by this afternoon," Dr. Chen continued. "We understand that emergency transfers require expedited processing, and your academic record speaks for itself." By noon, I had completed all necessary paperwork for my transfer to Northern State University. My transcript had been sent, my research portfolio had been reviewed, and my admission was confirmed for the spring semester beginning January 8th. 3 weeks from now, I would be starting fresh at a superior institution with full funding and research opportunities that aligned perfectly with my career goals. The next step was clearing out my current dorm room and retrieving my belongings before the residence halls closed for winter break. I had informed my roommate about the transfer, and she had helped me pack everything into boxes that could be stored temporarily at Professor Brooks' office. Which brought me to the final task of the day, cleaning out my locker at the student center, where I kept textbooks and personal items between classes. This seemed like a routine administrative detail, until I realized that word of my departure had already begun spreading through campus social networks. I was halfway through emptying my locker when Mason appeared in the hallway looking confused and slightly out of breath. Apparently, one of his friends who worked in campus maintenance had seen me moving boxes and mentioned it during their lunch break. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to maintain his usual confident demeanor, despite obvious uncertainty about the situation. "Cleaning out my locker," I replied, simply continuing to pack my remaining belongings into a cardboard box. Mason moved closer, studying the transfer paperwork that was visible in my stack of documents. His expression shifted from confusion to something approaching alarm as he processed what he was seeing. "Are you actually transferring schools?" he asked, his voice lacking its typical smugness. "Northern State University accepted me for spring semester," I confirmed, not looking up from my packing. "I start classes in 3 weeks." "But you are supposed to apologize and come back next semester," he said, his tone becoming more agitated. "Mom and Dad are expecting you to fix this situation." I straightened up to face him directly. "I have fixed the situation, just not in the way you expected." That's when I saw something I had never witnessed before in 24 years of observing my brother. Mason was genuinely panicked. The color drained from his face and his hands began trembling slightly as he processed the implications of my departure. "You cannot just leave," he said, his voice rising in pitch. "What about our family? What about working this out like adults?" "I am working it out exactly like an adult," I replied calmly. "I made a decision that prioritizes my education and future over dysfunctional family dynamics." Mason began pacing in the hallway, running his hands through his hair in obvious distress. Students walking past stared at his increasingly erratic behavior, but he seemed oblivious to their attention. "This is insane," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "You are overreacting to everything. This whole situation got blown out of proportion because you cannot handle seeing me succeed." I continued packing while he spiraled into what appeared to be a full anxiety attack. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and sweat began forming on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the building. "Polly, you have to listen to me," he said, desperately grabbing my arm to force my attention. "You cannot just disappear right now. There are things happening that you do not understand." "I understand enough," I said, gently removing his hand from my arm. "I understand that you have been running a pyramid scheme that targets elderly people in our neighborhood. I understand that our parents have been enabling your irresponsible behavior for years. And I understand that this family has never valued my achievements or potential." Mason's panic intensified visibly at my mention of the pyramid scheme. He looked around frantically to make sure no one else was within hearing distance before pulling me toward a more secluded corner of the hallway. "You do not know what you are talking about," he whispered harshly. "That business is completely legitimate, and you are just trying to sabotage me because you are jealous." "Mrs. Patterson cannot afford to lose her money, Mason," I said quietly. "Neither can Mr. and Mrs. Johnson or any of the other elderly people you have recruited into your scheme." His face went completely white as he realized that I had specific information about his victims. The confident facade he had maintained for weeks crumbled completely, revealing the desperate and frightened person underneath. "How do you know about them?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "I pay attention," I replied. "Unlike our parents, I actually care about the consequences of your actions." Mason slumped against the wall, looking like he might actually faint. His breathing was still rapid and irregular, and his hands were shaking visibly now. "You have to help me figure this out," he pleaded. "If you leave now, everything will fall apart. I need time to fix things before anyone gets hurt." "People are already getting hurt," I pointed out. "The question is whether you are going to take responsibility for that or continue hiding behind our parents' protection." That's when Mason said something that revealed the true depth of his desperation. "If you transfer schools and disappear, I will not be able to control what gets posted online." I stopped packing and turned to study his face carefully. "What do you mean by that?" Mason realized he had revealed too much and tried to backtrack. "Nothing. I just meant that people might misunderstand things if you suddenly leave without explanation." But the fear in his eyes told a different story. He was terrified about something being posted online, something that went beyond general family drama or embarrassing stories. "Mason," I said slowly, "what exactly are you afraid I might post?" His panic reached a new level as he understood that his slip had given me additional leverage. He began pacing again, muttering incoherently about misunderstandings and family loyalty. "Please," he said finally, his voice breaking slightly. "Whatever you are planning to do online, just wait. Give me a chance to explain everything properly." I had not been planning to post anything online, but his assumption revealed that he believed I had evidence worth sharing publicly. His terror at the thought of social media exposure suggested that the stakes were much higher than I had realized. "I am not planning to post anything right now," I said honestly. "I am focused on starting my new program at Northern State." The relief in his eyes was immediate, but short-lived. As I finished packing my locker and prepared to leave, Mason seemed to understand that my departure represented a fundamental shift in our family dynamics that he could not control or manipulate. "This is not over," he called after me as I walked toward the exit. "You are making a huge mistake." "No," I replied without turning around. "I am finally making the right choice." I had barely walked through my parents' front door when Mason burst out of the kitchen, his face flushed and his shirt wrinkled from what appeared to have been several hours of anxious pacing. Behind him, Mom and Dad emerged, wearing expressions of confused concern, mixed with parental authority. "We need to talk," Mason announced dramatically, gesturing toward the living room as if he was calling an emergency board meeting rather than a family discussion. Dad checked his watch with obvious irritation. "Mason called us home from work, claiming there was a family crisis that could not wait until this evening. This better be genuinely important." "It is important," Mason insisted, his voice carrying a tremor that I had never heard before. "Polly is planning something that could destroy our entire family." Mom immediately shifted into protective mode, moving closer to Mason as if shielding him from an imminent threat. "What is he talking about, Polly? What have you been planning?" "I transferred to Northern State University," I said simply, settling into the armchair across from the couch where my parents had positioned themselves on either side of Mason. "I start classes in 3 weeks with full funding and research opportunities." The silence that followed my announcement was profound. Dad's mouth actually fell open as he processed information that clearly contradicted every assumption he had made about how this situation would resolve. Mom blinked rapidly, as if she could change reality through sheer force of will. "That is impossible," Dad said finally. "You cannot transfer schools with 3 weeks left in your senior year. The logistics alone would be insurmountable." "Apparently not," I replied, pulling the admission paperwork from my bag and placing it on the coffee table between us. "Northern State accepted me yesterday with full research assistantship funding." Mom reached for the documents with trembling hands, scanning the official letterhead and Dr. Chen's signature as if looking for evidence of forgery. "But your degree, your graduation, all your hard work here will transfer completely," I explained. "I will graduate with the same honor status and better research opportunities than I had before." Mason, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, suddenly exploded with the pent-up anxiety he had been carrying since our campus encounter. "Show them the recordings, Polly. Show them what you have been planning to do with all your secret evidence." Both parents turned to stare at me with expressions of growing alarm. The word recordings hung in the air like an unexploded bomb that could detonate at any moment. "What recordings?" Dad asked slowly, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when he sensed potential legal complications from his work as an insurance adjuster. I had not planned to reveal my evidence during this conversation, but Mason's panic had forced the issue. Taking a deep breath, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the audio files I'd been collecting for months. I have been documenting our family conversations for a while, I said calmly. Initially just for my own clarity because I felt like my perspective was constantly being dismissed or reframed. You have been secretly recording us, Mom asked, her voice rising in pitch and volume. That is a violation of privacy and trust that I cannot even comprehend. Let me play you the conversation Mason and I had in the kitchen during Thanksgiving, I said, selecting the audio file and placing my phone on the coffee table. Mason lunged forward as if to grab the device, but Dad caught his arm and held him back. Let her play it, he said grimly. We need to understand what we are dealing with. The recording quality was surprisingly clear. Mason's voice came through distinctly as he described his investment program, admitted it was primarily recruitment-based, and laughed about targeting elderly neighbors who could not afford to lose money. His dismissive comments about Mrs. Patterson and the Johnsons sounded even more callous when played back in our family living room. Most damaging was the section where he explicitly stated that our parents would never believe my version of events over his, followed by his casual admission that even if I was right about the fraud, he didn't care because the scheme was profitable. The silence after the recording ended was deafening. Mom sat frozen with her hand over her mouth, staring at the phone as if it had transformed into a poisonous snake. Dad's face had gone completely red, and a vein in his forehead was pulsing visibly. Mason, Dad said in a voice I had never heard before, low and dangerous and completely devoid of his usual protective warmth. Is this recording accurate? Mason's panic shifted into desperate damage control mode. She edited it. She took things out of context and pieced together different conversations to make me sound bad. This is exactly the kind of vindictive manipulation I was warning you about. Actually, I said calmly, I have the complete unedited version with timestamps. I also have several other recordings from different conversations. I played a second clip from a family dinner 2 months earlier, where Mom and Dad discussed Mason's repeated job failures. Instead of expressing concern about his behavior patterns, they spent 15 minutes analyzing which employers had been unfairly biased against him and brainstorming ways to help him find better workplace environments. The third recording was the most revealing. It captured a conversation between our parents after Mason had been fired from his job at the electronics store for repeatedly showing up late and arguing with customers. Rather than discussing natural consequences or accountability measures, they debated whether to increase his allowance or help him apply for disability benefits based on workplace anxiety. This is what our family sounds like when you think I am not listening, I said quietly. Hours of energy spent protecting Mason from consequences while holding me to completely different standards. Mom began crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the implications of hearing our family dysfunction played back objectively. Dad was staring at the wall above my head, his jaw clenched and his hands gripped tightly in his lap. There's more. I continued, feeling both terrible and empowered by their shock. I have documentation about the college fund situation and the pattern of financial manipulation over the years. I pulled out the bank statements and emails I had collected, spreading them across the coffee table in an organized display that told a clear story of systematic resource redistribution. The evidence showed that my college fund had been depleted gradually over 4 years to cover Mason's various disasters while maintaining the fiction that my scholarships made parental financial support unnecessary. My work-study earnings from freshman and sophomore year were deposited into the joint account, I explained, pointing to specific transactions. But they were immediately transferred to cover Mason's credit card debt and car payments. Dad finally looked directly at the documents, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and what appeared to be genuine shame. I did not realize you were tracking these transactions. I wasn't tracking them initially, I admitted. I was just trying to understand why my funding was always uncertain while Mason's expenses were automatically covered. The most damaging evidence was an email thread between our parents from 6 months earlier discussing how to balance investment between their children based on different life paths and financial needs. The language was careful and euphemistic, but the meaning was unmistakable. They had explicitly decided to prioritize Mason's immediate wants over my long-term educational goals. Mason had been listening to this revelation in increasingly desperate silence, but as the full scope of my evidence became clear, he seemed to understand that his usual manipulation tactics would be ineffective. "You are destroying our family," he said finally, his voice cracking with emotion that seemed genuine for the first time in years. "Everything I have worked for, everything our parents have sacrificed, you are going to ruin it all because you cannot handle not being the center of attention." "I am not destroying anything," I replied calmly. "I am documenting what already exists." That's when Dad surprised everyone in the room by standing up abruptly and walking to the window, his back turned toward the rest of us as he processed the weight of the evidence I had presented. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked without turning around, his voice barely audible. "I have been documenting our family dynamics for about 8 months, I answered honestly. But I only decided to transfer schools yesterday after realizing that staying would mean enabling this dysfunction indefinitely." Mom's crying intensified as the reality of the situation crystallized. Her golden boy was running a fraudulent scheme that exploited elderly neighbors, and her daughter had been systematically documenting years of family favoritism and financial manipulation. "What do you want from us?" she asked through her tears. "What do we need to do to fix this?" It was the first time in my adult life that either parent had asked what I wanted, rather than telling me what I should do. The question caught me completely off guard, because I had spent so much energy on gathering evidence and planning my escape that I had not fully considered what resolution might actually look like. "I want honesty," I said finally. "I want acknowledgement that our family dynamics have been unhealthy and unfair. And I want Mason to take responsibility for the harm he has caused to innocent people." Mason's panic reached a new level of intensity as he realized that my evidence could expose his fraudulent schemes to potential criminal investigation. "You cannot show this to anyone else," he pleaded. "If this gets out, it will not just hurt me, it will destroy our entire family's reputation." "Maybe," I acknowledged. "But continuing to enable your behavior will definitely hurt more innocent people. Mrs. Patterson and the Johnsons deserve better than being scammed by someone they trust." The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed the implications of the choice I was presenting: enable Mason's continued manipulation and fraud, or face the consequences of years of dysfunction and favoritism. For the first time in my life, the decision was not automatically predetermined in Mason's favor. The family meeting stretched into its 3rd hour as the full scope of the crisis became increasingly clear to everyone involved. What had started as Mason's attempt to control my departure had evolved into a comprehensive examination of our family's dysfunction that none of us could have anticipated. Dad returned from the window and sat heavily in his recliner, looking older than I had ever seen him. "Show us everything," he said quietly. "If we are going to deal with this situation properly, we need to understand exactly what we are facing." I had been prepared for denial, anger, and continued protection of Mason. I had not expected genuine willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, but their reaction to the recordings and financial evidence had clearly shaken their fundamental assumptions about our family dynamics. The pyramid scheme is just one piece of a larger pattern. I began pulling additional documentation from my bag. Mason has been running multiple fraudulent activities, and some of them involve more serious legal violations. Mason's face went completely white as he realized I had evidence beyond what I had already revealed. "You do not know what you are talking about," he whispered, but his voice lacked any conviction. "Actually, I do," I replied, spreading photos across the coffee table that showed Mason's social media accounts promoting his fake business success. He has been operating as an online influencer and selling mentorship courses based on fabricated achievements. The screenshots I had collected told a disturbing story of systematic deception. Mason's Instagram account portrayed him as a successful entrepreneur who had achieved financial freedom through innovative business strategies. His Facebook page featured testimonials from supposed clients who had transformed their lives using his guidance and expertise. Most damaging were the screenshots of the online courses he had been selling for $299 each, promising to teach people the insider secrets of building wealth through proven investment strategies. The sales pages featured elaborate claims about his business success, complete with fake profit statements and manufactured credibility indicators. "How many people have purchased these courses?" Dad asked, studying the marketing materials with obvious horror. "Based on the payment platform statistics, approximately 400 people have enrolled over the past 6 months. I answered, showing him the revenue data I had accessed through Mason's poorly secured accounts. That represents almost $120,000 in fraudulent income. Mom made a choking sound as she processed the financial scope of Mason's deception. $120,000. Where is that money? Most of it has been spent on maintaining his fake lifestyle for social media content. I explained, showing them credit card statements and purchase receipts I had discovered. Designer clothes, expensive restaurant meals, luxury hotel stays, all documented and posted online to support his image as a successful entrepreneur. The evidence painted a picture of someone who had constructed an elaborate fictional identity specifically to exploit people seeking legitimate business guidance. Mason had not just been running a simple pyramid scheme. He had created a comprehensive fraud operation that targeted vulnerable people across multiple platforms. But the worst revelation was still to come. Among the documents I had collected was correspondence showing that Mason had been using our deceased grandmother's identity to establish business credit accounts and apply for small business loans. He has been using Grandma Helen's social security number and personal information to create fake business credentials. I said, my voice shaking slightly as I revealed the most serious criminal activity I had uncovered. Dad's reaction was immediate and explosive. He shot out of his chair with an expression of rage I had never witnessed in 24 years of knowing him. "You did what?" he roared at Mason, who cowered back into the couch as if trying to disappear completely. "It was just temporary," Mason stammered. "I was going to fix everything before anyone noticed. The business loans were legitimate investments in my company development." "Grandma Helen has been dead for 3 years. Mom said in a voice barely above a whisper. "You have been committing identity theft using your own grandmother's information." The full weight of Mason's criminal activity was finally becoming clear to our parents. This was not a case of poor judgment or temporary mistakes. This was systematic fraud that involved multiple felony violations, including elder abuse, identity theft, wire fraud, and securities violations. "How long have you known about all of this?" Dad asked me, his anger now redirected toward understanding the scope of the cover-up. "I started gathering evidence 8 months ago when I noticed inconsistencies in Mason's stories," I admitted. "But I only discovered the identity theft last week when I was researching the pyramid scheme more thoroughly." "And you have been sitting on felony evidence for 8 months," he continued, his voice rising again. "I have been trying to understand what was happening and figure out how to address it appropriately," I replied defensively. "I am not a lawyer or law enforcement officer. I needed time to document everything properly before making accusations that could destroy our family." That's when Mom asked the question that changed the trajectory of our entire conversation. "Have you already reported this to authorities?" "Not yet," I said carefully. "I have been consulting with an attorney about the best way to proceed, but I have not filed any official reports." The relief in the room was palpable as both parents realized that the situation, while serious, was not yet irreversibly public. Mason seemed to understand for the first time that I had been protecting him even while documenting his crimes. "What do you want from us?" Dad asked again, his tone shifting from anger to something approaching negotiation. "I want Mason to immediately shut down all fraudulent activities," I said firmly. "I want him to make restitution to the elderly neighbors he has scammed. I want him to turn himself in to authorities voluntarily rather than waiting to be caught. And I want both of you to acknowledge that this family's enabling patterns contributed to this crisis. Mason began hyperventilating as he absorbed my demands. You want me to confess to crimes and go to prison. You want me to destroy my entire future because you are angry about family favoritism. I want you to take responsibility for choices you have already made, I corrected. The crimes have already been committed. The question is whether you face the consequences voluntarily with family support or whether you continue lying until you are arrested and prosecuted without any leverage for cooperation. The legal reality was becoming clear to all of us. Mason's fraudulent activities involved multiple state and federal violations that would eventually be discovered whether I reported them or not. The pyramid scheme would collapse when recruitment slowed down, generating complaints from victims. The online course fraud would be exposed when customers demanded refunds or reported him to consumer protection agencies. The identity theft would surface when credit monitoring services flagged suspicious activity on our grandmother's accounts. Actually, I continued, there is something else you should know. I have already been in contact with several of Mason's victims, and they are planning to file complaints whether our family cooperates or not. This was not entirely true, but I needed them to understand that staying silent was no longer an option for protecting Mason from consequences. Mason's panic attack intensified as he realized his crimes had already begun generating their own momentum toward exposure and prosecution. Who did you talk to? He gasped between rapid breaths. Mrs. Patterson called me last week asking questions about your investment program. I said which was actually true. She was concerned because she had not seen any returns and could not reach you for clarification. When I explained what pyramid schemes were, she became very upset about being deceived. The domino effect of Mason's fraud was already beginning. His victims were starting to ask questions that would lead to complaints investigations and ultimately criminal charges. My evidence could help prosecutors build a stronger case, but it was not necessary for Mason to face serious legal consequences. How much time do we have? Mom asked quietly, her maternal instincts shifting toward damage control, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. Not much, I admitted. Mrs. Patterson mentioned talking to other neighbors about their concerns. Once elderly fraud victims start comparing notes and sharing information, consumer protection agencies get involved very quickly. Dad sat in silence for several minutes, clearly struggling to accept that his beloved son was facing potential prison time for serious financial crimes. The protective instincts that had enabled Mason's behavior for years were warring with the undeniable evidence of criminal activity that could no longer be dismissed or reframed. What kind of legal consequences are we looking at? He asked finally. Identity theft and wire fraud are federal felonies. I explained based on my research and consultations with Sarah Thompson. The sentences can range from several months to several years, depending on the amount of money involved and the defendant's criminal history. Mason began crying for the first time since childhood, apparently realizing that his actions had consequences that his parents could not protect him from. I never meant for any of this to happen, he sobbed. Everything just got out of control, and I did not know how to fix it. That is exactly why our family's enabling patterns have been so destructive, I said gently. You never learned to face consequences or take responsibility for your choices because Mom and Dad always protected you from uncomfortable results. The room fell silent except for Mason's quiet crying and the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. 24 years of family dysfunction had led to this moment where the truth could no longer be hidden or reframed. Finally, Dad spoke with a voice that sounded defeated but determined. What do we need to do to minimize the damage to everyone involved? It was the first time in my adult life that my father had asked for my guidance rather than dismissing my perspective or imposing his own solutions. We need a plan that prioritizes restitution for victims and voluntary cooperation with authorities, I said. The legal system treats voluntary disclosure and cooperation much more favorably than defensive resistance after being caught. For the first time in our family's history, the focus was shifting from protecting Mason to addressing the harm he had caused to innocent people. The conversation that followed would determine whether our family could finally break its destructive patterns or continue enabling behavior that hurt everyone involved. 6 months later, I stood on the campus of Northern State University, watching the spring semester end, with a sense of accomplishment that felt fundamentally different from any academic achievement I had experienced before. My research assistantship with Dr. Chen had exceeded every expectation, and my thesis project on family systems intervention had been selected for presentation at the National Psychology Conference. But the real transformation had nothing to do with grades or academic recognition. The plan we developed that December evening in our family living room had been implemented with surprising success, though not without significant challenges and setbacks along the way. Mason had followed through on every commitment he made during our crisis meeting, though his cooperation had been motivated more by fear of criminal prosecution than genuine remorse about harming innocent people. Within 1 week of our confrontation, he had shut down all fraudulent online activities and contacted each of his pyramid scheme victims to arrange repayment schedules. Mrs. Patterson received her full investment back, plus interest, as did Mr. and Mrs. Johnson and the 8 other elderly neighbors who had trusted Mason with their limited savings. The online course fraud required more complex restitution since his victims were scattered across multiple states. Working with consumer protection attorneys, Mason had been required to provide full refunds to all purchasers and pay additional penalties for false advertising violations. The total financial impact exceeded $150,000, which depleted every asset he had accumulated through his fraudulent activities. Most importantly, he had voluntarily reported his identity theft violations to federal authorities and cooperated fully with their investigation. The use of our grandmother's personal information had been the most serious criminal charge he faced, but voluntary disclosure and complete cooperation had resulted in a plea agreement that included restitution probation and community service rather than imprisonment. The legal process had been emotionally draining for our entire family, but it had also forced conversations about accountability and enabling that had never happened before. Mom and Dad were required to attend family counseling sessions as part of Mason's probation requirements, which created space for honest discussion about the patterns that had contributed to the crisis. The hardest part was accepting that our protection had actually been harmful, Mom had told me during one of our weekly phone calls. We thought we were helping Mason by shielding him from consequences, but we were actually preventing him from developing the skills he needed to make better choices. Dad's transformation had been even more dramatic. His identity as the protective father who could solve any problem for his children had been shattered by the realization that his interventions had enabled criminal behavior. I spent so many years making excuses for Mason that I forgot my job was to help him become a responsible adult, not to prevent him from experiencing the results of his actions. The financial restitution had required our parents to liquidate Mason's college fund and take out a second mortgage on the family home. But they had also insisted on fully restoring my education fund, with interest acknowledging that the systematic redistribution of resources had been unfair and damaging to my academic goals. "We owe you an apology that goes far beyond money," Dad had said when he called to discuss the financial arrangements. "We failed you as parents by creating a family system that prioritized protecting Mason over supporting your achievements and potential." Mason himself had been the slowest to demonstrate genuine change, but even he had eventually begun acknowledging the harm he had caused to his victims and family members. His community service requirement involved working with elderly fraud prevention programs, which had given him direct exposure to the devastating impact of financial scams on vulnerable populations. "I never thought about Mrs. Patterson as a real person," he had admitted during one of our supervised family therapy sessions. "She was just someone who might give me money. I did not consider that losing her savings could affect her ability to pay for medicine or heating bills." The therapy process had also helped me understand my own role in the family dysfunction. My years of silent compliance and academic overachievement had been my way of coping with the favoritism and instability, but my silence had also enabled the system to continue operating without challenge. You protected yourself by becoming indispensable through academic success, Dr. Patricia Williams, our family therapist, had explained. But that strategy also prevented you from advocating for your own needs or challenging unfair treatment directly. Learning to set boundaries and advocate for myself had been as important as Mason learning to accept responsibility for his choices. The transfer to Northern State had given me physical and emotional space to develop my own identity outside the family system, while the research opportunities with Dr. Chen had helped me understand family dynamics from a professional perspective. My thesis project had focused on intervention strategies for families with enabling patterns using anonymized case studies that drew heavily on my own experience. The research had been emotionally challenging but ultimately therapeutic, allowing me to transform our family's pain into knowledge that could help others facing similar situations. Your work has the potential to influence how therapists approach family systems intervention, Dr. Chen had told me during my final thesis defense. Personal experience combined with rigorous academic analysis creates insights that are both scientifically valuable and practically applicable. The presentation at the National Psychology Conference had been well received, and several graduate programs had already expressed interest in my continuing this research at the doctoral level. But more importantly, I had received emails from conference attendees who recognized similar patterns in their own families and were seeking guidance about intervention strategies. One email particularly stood out from a woman whose brother had been running investment scams that targeted their immigrant parents' community. Reading your research helped me understand that protecting him from consequences was actually making the situation worse, she had written. Your framework for family intervention gave me the courage to document his activities and seek help from appropriate authorities. The academic success felt meaningful in a way that my previous achievements had not, because it was connected to helping other people rather than just meeting external expectations or family approval. But perhaps the most significant change had been in my relationship with my parents. The crisis had forced us to have honest conversations about favoritism, financial manipulation, and enabling patterns that had shaped our family dynamics for years. While the process had been painful, it had also created space for genuine relationship building, based on mutual respect rather than predetermined roles. I am proud of the way you handled this situation, Dad had told me during my graduation ceremony visit home. You could have simply left and let Mason face the consequences alone, but you chose to create a path forward that protected his victims while still giving our family a chance to heal. Mom had been even more direct about her transformation. I spent so many years seeing Mason as fragile and needing protection that I forgot you were the child who actually needed support and encouragement. You were handling adult responsibilities and making mature decisions, while I was treating him like a victim of circumstances beyond his control. The relationship with Mason himself remained complicated, but was slowly improving. His probation requirements included ongoing therapy and financial counseling, which had helped him develop better understanding of impulse control and ethical decision-making. He had also begun working a legitimate job at a local accounting firm, where his natural charisma was being channeled toward customer service rather than manipulation. I still do not completely understand how my actions affected other people, he had admitted during our most recent conversation. But I am learning to pause and consider consequences before making decisions that seem easy or profitable. The change was gradual and sometimes inconsistent, but it represented genuine progress toward accountability and empathy that had never existed before. As I packed my belongings for the move to my doctoral program at Stanford University, where I would continue research on family intervention strategies, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that December evening when my parents demanded an apology I was not willing to give. The decision to refuse their ultimatum and transfer schools had felt terrifying at the time, but it had opened opportunities and relationships that exceeded anything I could have imagined. More importantly, it had taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a family is to refuse to enable their dysfunction, even when that refusal creates temporary pain and conflict. The elderly neighbors who had trusted Mason with their savings were now financially secure again. Mason was learning to take responsibility for his choices and developing legitimate work skills. Our parents were attending therapy and making genuine efforts to address the enabling patterns that had damaged their relationships with both children. And I was pursuing research that combined my academic interests with my personal mission to help other families break destructive cycles before they resulted in serious harm to innocent people. The life lesson that emerged from our family's crisis was both simple and profound. True strength is not about maintaining peace at any cost, or protecting people from the consequences of their choices. True strength is about having the courage to demand justice and accountability, especially from those who are supposed to love and protect you. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's harmful behavior, even when that refusal requires painful consequences for everyone involved. And sometimes the path to genuine healing requires destroying the illusions that have allowed dysfunction to flourish in darkness. 6 months after that confrontation in our living room, every member of our family was healthier, more honest, and more capable of genuine relationship than we had been in years. The process had been difficult and sometimes heartbreaking, but it had also been necessary for any of us to develop authentic connections based on truth rather than manipulation. As I drove toward my new life in California, I felt grateful for the crisis that had forced our family to confront its dysfunction. Without Mason's criminal behavior and my decision to document it, we might have continued the destructive patterns indefinitely causing harm to innocent people while preventing any of us from reaching our full potential. The future felt full of possibilities that had been unimaginable when I was trapped in the role of compliant daughter who prioritized family peace over personal integrity. I was finally free to pursue my goals without the weight of dysfunction and favoritism that had shaped every previous decision. Most importantly, I was using my experience to help other families recognize and address similar patterns before they resulted in serious legal or financial consequences. The research I was conducting had the potential to prevent other vulnerable people from being victimized by family members whose harmful behavior had been enabled rather than challenged. The pain of confronting family dysfunction had been transformed into purpose that extended far beyond personal healing to meaningful contribution to others facing similar challenges. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where protecting family peace required you to ignore harmful behavior? How did you balance loyalty to loved ones with responsibility to protect innocent people from being hurt? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how families can learn to address dysfunction before it escalates to serious consequences. Thank you for listening to my story and for your support in sharing these important conversations about family dynamics and personal accountability. I hope that by sharing my experience, other people will find the courage to demand justice and healing in their own families, even when that process requires difficult decisions and painful consequences. Please like this video if it resonated with your own experiences. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming family dysfunction, and share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding that sometimes the most loving choice is refusing to enable harmful behavior. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who need to know they are not alone in facing these challenging family dynamics.